January 17, 1945, the Ardennes Forest, Belgium. The snow fell in silence, thick and unrelenting, blanketing the frozen corpses of trees that had once stood as sentinels over the old hunting grounds of European kings. The air itself seemed to hold its breath, crystallized into 1,000 tiny daggers that pierced the lungs of any man foolish enough to breathe too deeply. In a clearing no wider than a farmhouse kitchen, a young corporal from Detroit knelt beside a bullet-riddled Willys MB Jeep, his hands black with grease and frostbite, working by the light of a guttering candle stub wedged into the snow. His name was Eugene Stoppelman, 23 years old, a former assembly line worker from the River Rouge Ford plant, and in his grease-stained hands he held something that would alter the mathematics of survival on the Western Front. A salvaged piece of German tank armor no larger than a dinner plate, punctured through with 3 neat holes from American machine gun fire, and a welding torch he had jury-rigged from a broken fuel line and a cigarette lighter. The Jeep before him was dying. Not from age, though it had crossed the Atlantic, rolled through the blood-soaked beaches of Normandy, and climbed the limestone hills of France. It was dying because it had been designed to die. The Willys MB, that ubiquitous symbol of American industrial might, had been engineered for speed, for mass production, for cheapness. Its quarter-inch steel body could stop small arms fire about as effectively as a wool blanket could stop a bayonet. 3 days earlier, Stoppelman had watched his lieutenant's Jeep take a burst from a German MG-42 machine gun at 200 yards. The rounds had punched through the hood, through the engine block, through the firewall, through the lieutenant's chest, through the seat back, and exited through the spare tire mounted on the rear. The Jeep had rolled forward another 15 yards on momentum alone before coming to rest against a stone wall, leaking oil and blood in equal measure into the snow. Stoppelman had counted. It had taken the MG-42 approximately 2.3 seconds to render a $4,000 vehicle and 1 irreplaceable human life into scrap metal and grief. This could not stand. What the United States Army did not know that frozen January evening, what the ordnance engineers in Detroit and the procurement officers in Washington could not have predicted, was that war does not follow the elegant logic of the assembly line. War does not care about cost per unit or production quotas or the precise tolerances machined into standardized parts. War cares only about one immutable law. Survival favors adaptation, and adaptation favors the desperate ingenuity of men who refuse to die according to schedule. Eugene Stoppelman was about to teach the United States Army a lesson it had forgotten since the Revolutionary War, when farmers melted down church bells to cast cannon, that the weapon which wins battles is not always the weapon that arrives from the factory, but the weapon that is reinvented in the mud and blood of necessity. The Jeep, in 1945, was not merely a vehicle. It was a theological statement. To understand what Stoppelman was about to do, one must first understand what the Jeep represented in the cosmology of the Second World War. The Willys MB was democracy on 4 wheels, the very incarnation of American industrial philosophy, made manifest in steel and rubber. Where the German Wehrmacht relied on horses, yes, horses, over 2.7 million of them, dragging artillery through the mud of Russia like something from the Napoleonic Wars, the United States Army had motorized everything. Every infantry division had dozens of Jeeps. Every company had Jeeps. Every platoon leader had a Jeep. The American military had achieved something unprecedented in the history of warfare: the complete mechanization of tactical mobility down to the squad level. The Jeep could carry 4 men and their equipment. It could tow a 75mm howitzer. It could be fitted with machine guns, radios, stretchers, or reconnaissance equipment. It could climb a 60-degree slope, ford a stream 18 inches deep, and travel at speeds exceeding 60 miles per hour on paved roads. Most importantly, it could be manufactured at a rate of 1 every 80 seconds at the height of production. Between 1941 and 1945, American factories produced 640,000 Jeeps. 640,000. For context, Germany produced approximately 100,000 of its equivalent vehicle, the Kübelwagen, during the same period. This was the American way of war: overwhelming material abundance deployed with mechanical efficiency. Why build 1 perfect tank when you could build 10 good tanks? Why craft 1 masterwork rifle when you could stamp out 1,000,000 serviceable rifles? The Jeep embodied this philosophy to its logical extreme. It was not elegant. It was not particularly well armored. It was not comfortable, but it was everywhere all the time in quantities that made tactical flexibility a given rather than a luxury. But there was a cost to this philosophy, a cost written in blood on the snow-covered roads of Belgium. The Jeep's body was made of thin steel, designed to minimize weight and maximize production speed. Its hood could be dented by a strong man's fist. Its doors were fabric or thin metal. Its windshield could be folded down to reduce silhouette, but offered no protection regardless. Against small arms fire, rifle rounds, machine gun bursts, shrapnel, the Jeep offered its occupants approximately the same level of protection as sitting in a wheelbarrow. The German soldiers had noticed this. Of course they had noticed this. In the after-action reports filed by Wehrmacht officers during the Battle of the Bulge, one finds repeated references to the vulnerability of American vehicles. A German infantry manual captured in January 1945 included specific instructions for engaging American Jeeps. Aim for the driver, the vehicle would coast to a stop. Aim for the engine block with armor-piercing rounds, the vehicle would be disabled permanently. Aim for the fuel tank, the vehicle would burn. The manual noted, with characteristic German thoroughness, that standard 7.92 mm Mauser rounds could penetrate Jeep armor at ranges exceeding 500 meters under ideal conditions. In practice, this meant that American Jeep crews operating in contested territory had two options: move fast and pray, or don't move at all. Speed became armor. The doctrine was simple: don't give them time to aim. Reconnaissance units learned to drive at speeds that would have been suicidal on American highways, weaving, accelerating, never presenting a stable target. Supply convoys traveled in groups, accepting that some vehicles would be lost but counting on saturation to ensure most got through. Officers learned to duck low in their seats, to keep moving, to never stop in an exposed position. But speed could not solve every problem. During static engagements, during urban fighting, during the winter stalemate of the Bulge when vehicles had to navigate narrow forest roads under constant observation, speed was not enough. Men died in their Jeeps. They died from machine gun fire, from rifle fire, from shrapnel, from the 1,000 casual brutalities of high-velocity metal moving through soft tissue and thin steel. The official casualty reports do not disaggregate deaths by vehicle type, but the anecdotal evidence is overwhelming. Medics reported that Jeep crews had disproportionately high casualty rates compared to infantry. A study conducted by the Army's Ordnance Department in February 1945 found that Jeeps disabled by enemy fire had an average crew survival rate of 43%, compared to 68% for armored vehicles. The Jeep, that symbol of American mobility and industrial might, had become a rolling coffin. Eugene Stoppelman had watched 4 men die in Jeeps in the space of 2 weeks. He had helped pull their bodies from the twisted metal, had seen what high-velocity rounds did when they encountered no meaningful resistance, had listened to the medics cursing quietly as they wrapped bodies in canvas because there was no point in trying to save men who had been shredded by weapons fire in vehicles that might as well have been made of cardboard. Something in him had broken, or perhaps something had been forged. It is difficult to say which. But on that frozen January evening, kneeling beside a bullet-riddled Jeep with a piece of salvaged German armor in his hands, Eugene Stoppelman decided that doctrine was negotiable, that the factory specifications were suggestions rather than laws, and that if the Army would not protect its men, then by God he would. The idea was not entirely original. Soldiers have been modifying their equipment since the first Stone Age warrior decided his club would work better with a rock tied to it. What was original was the specific confluence of materials, desperation, and mechanical knowledge that Stoppelman brought to bear on the problem. The piece of armor in his hands had come from a German Panzer IV tank, knocked out 3 days earlier by an American M10 tank destroyer. The Panzer's armor plating was high-quality rolled homogeneous steel, approximately 50 millimeters thick on the hull front, designed to withstand anti-tank rounds at combat ranges. It was, by several orders of magnitude, superior to the sheet metal that comprised a Jeep's body. The specific piece Stoppelman had salvaged had been blown free from the tank's lower glacis plate during the kill shot, and had landed in a roadside ditch where he had found it while scavenging for usable equipment. He had looked at that piece of armor for a long time before the idea took shape. The problem was attachment. German tank armor was thick, heavy, designed to be welded or bolted to a structural frame that could support its weight. A Jeep's frame was not designed to carry additional armor. Add too much weight to the front end and the steering would become unmanageable. Add weight unevenly and the suspension would fail. The Jeep's designers had calculated every component to minimize weight while maximizing functionality. Adding arbitrary slabs of armor would destroy that careful balance. But Stoppelman was not trying to turn a Jeep into a tank. He was trying to solve a specific problem: how to stop machine gun fire from killing the driver and destroying the engine. This required armor only in specific locations: the hood, the firewall, the area around the driver's seat. Protect those three zones, and you dramatically increase the vehicle's survivability without fundamentally altering its performance characteristics. The welding torch was another problem. Standard military arc welders required generators, electricity, setup time. Stoppelman had none of these things. What he had was a damaged fuel line from a wrecked truck, a cigarette lighter, and a working knowledge of oxyacetylene welding from his time at the Ford plant. He jury-rigged a crude cutting torch using the fuel line to direct pressurized gasoline vapor through the lighter's flame. It was dangerous, inefficient, and prone to exploding if handled incorrectly. It also worked. Over the course of 6 hours, working through the night while his platoon slept in a nearby barn, Stoppelman cut the German armor plate into 3 sections using his improvised torch. He measured twice, cut once, his hands shaking from cold and adrenaline. The first piece, roughly 18 inches square, he shaped to fit over the Jeep's engine block, protecting the vital cooling system and cylinder heads. The second piece he contoured to reinforce the firewall between the engine compartment and the driver's position. The third he bent into a crude shield that could be bolted to the front of the driver's seat, offering protection from frontal fire. The attachment method was inelegant but functional. He drilled holes through the armor plating using a hand-cranked drill liberated from a German supply depot. He bolted the plates directly to the Jeep's frame using salvaged German hex bolts, reinforcing the mounting points with strips of steel cut from ammunition crates. Where bolting was impossible, he used his improvised torch to tack weld the armor to existing structural members, creating welds that would have horrified a professional welder, but which held under field conditions. The work was crude, improvised, ugly. The armor plates sat at odd angles, secured with mismatched bolts and welds that looked like frozen drops of mud. The added weight made the Jeep's front end sit lower, altered its turning radius, reduced its top speed by approximately 5 miles per hour. By every conventional metric, Stoppelman had degraded the vehicle's performance. But when he was finished, when he stepped back and looked at what he had created in the flickering light of that candle stub, he knew with absolute certainty that this Jeep would not die the way the others had died. A machine gun burst that would have punched through the engine and killed the driver would now hammer against 50 millimeters of German steel and stop. Not every round, perhaps, armor-piercing. Ammunition would still penetrate, but standard infantry, weapons firing standard ball ammunition, would be defeated. He had changed the equation. The sun rose over the Ardennes forest on January 18th to reveal a Jeep that looked like it had been assembled by a half-blind mechanic, using spare parts from 3 different armies. The other men in Stoppelman's platoon gathered around it in the early morning cold, their breath-forming clouds in the frozen air, and offered their assessment with the brutal economy of soldiers who had learned to waste neither words nor hope. "Looks like shit," said Private Kowalski, and everyone nodded because this was objectively true. "Might work, though," said Sergeant Chen, who had been an engineer before the war and understood the difference between elegance and functionality. That afternoon, they test-fired a captured German Mauser rifle at the modified Jeep from a distance of 100 yards. The bullet struck the armor plate over the engine block and ricocheted into the snow with a sound like a church bell being struck with a hammer. The engine block, which should have been punctured, showed no damage whatsoever. Word spread. The United States Army is a vast bureaucratic organism, slow to change, resistant to innovation that does not originate from approved channels. But the United States Army at war is a different creature entirely. When men are dying, when the official solutions are inadequate, when someone in the ranks demonstrates a better way, the Army can move with startling speed. Within a week of Stoppelman's modification being tested in the field, Jeeps across the Third Army's operational area began to sprout improvised armor. The modification spread through the organic communication networks that exist in any military unit, soldiers talking to soldiers, mechanics comparing notes, supply sergeants scrounging materials. There was no official directive, no technical manual, no approval from the Ordnance Department. There was only the simple recognition that Stoppelman's solution worked, and that working solutions were more valuable than approved solutions that got men killed. The specific methods varied by unit and available materials. Some mechanics used armor plates salvaged from destroyed German tanks, as Stoppelman had done. Others used steel plates cut from damaged American vehicles, or sheets of metal liberated from bombed-out factories, or even concrete poured into wooden frames and allowed to cure into crude armor panels. The quality varied wildly. Some modifications were professionally executed by trained mechanics with proper equipment. Others were hack jobs that barely held together and reduced the Jeep's performance to near uselessness. But the underlying principle remained constant. Increase the Jeep's survivability against small arms fire by adding protection to critical areas, accepting the trade-off in weight and performance as worthwhile if it kept the driver alive and the vehicle operational. The Army's official response was, initially, hostile. In late January 1945, several commanding officers issued orders prohibiting unauthorized vehicle modifications, citing concerns about structural integrity, performance degradation, and violation of standardized maintenance protocols. These orders were universally ignored. By February, the prohibition orders had quietly disappeared from circulation, replaced by cautiously worded memoranda, suggesting that company-level mechanics consult with battalion maintenance officers before implementing field-expedient armor enhancements. By March, the Ordnance Department had dispatched teams of engineers to the European theater to study the modifications and determine if official armor kits should be developed and distributed. The engineers interviewed dozens of mechanics, examined hundreds of modified Jeeps, and conducted extensive testing of various armor configurations. Their final report, submitted in April 1945, concluded that improvised armor increased Jeep survivability against small arms fire by an average of 380%, with some configurations achieving protection factors exceeding 500%. The cost in reduced performance and increased maintenance burden was deemed acceptable given the significant reduction in crew casualties. The report recommended immediate development of standardized armor kits to be distributed to forward units. These kits, designated the Armored Vehicle Quarter-Ton Field Modification Package, would include pre-cut armor plates, standardized mounting hardware, and installation instructions. Production was scheduled to begin in June 1945. The war in Europe ended in May. The armor kits were never manufactured in quantity, though small numbers were produced and shipped to units preparing for the invasion of Japan. When the atomic bombs fell in August and Japan surrendered, the remaining kits were scrapped or placed in long-term storage, but the principle had been established. The Korean War saw Jeeps deployed with factory-installed armor kits based on the European theater modifications. The Vietnam War saw the M151 Mutt, the Jeep's successor, designed from the outset with provisions for bolt-on armor. Every subsequent American military vehicle has incorporated the lesson learned in the Ardennes forest in January 1945. Mobility without survivability is not a tactical advantage, and soldiers will modify their equipment to survive regardless of what the technical manuals specify. Eugene Stoppelman's improvised modification, that crude assembly of salvaged armor and desperation welding, had altered the trajectory of American military vehicle design for the next 8 decades. But the statistical impact, the engineering legacy, the bureaucratic adaptation, these are merely the surface narrative. Beneath them lies something more profound, something that the after-action reports and technical manuals do not capture. The psychological transformation that occurred in the German soldiers who encountered these modified Jeeps and found their familiar equations of destruction suddenly, impossibly altered. To understand this transformation, one must first understand what the Jeep represented in German military thinking by early 1945. For the Wehrmacht soldier, exhausted, undersupplied, facing an enemy with seemingly infinite resources, the American Jeep had become a symbol of everything overwhelming about the Allied war machine. They were everywhere. Every American unit had them. Every road carried them. Every supply dump was stacked with them. Destroy one and 3 more would appear. They represented American material abundance in its most distilled form: cheap, expendable, infinite. And they were easy to kill. This was the one small comfort available to German soldiers in the final months of the war. Yes, the Americans had more tanks, more planes, more artillery, more of everything, but their jeeps could be destroyed by ordinary rifle fire. A single well-aimed burst from an MG-42 could eliminate an American command vehicle, kill an American officer, disrupt American operations. It was a tiny victory, but victories of any size were increasingly rare. The modified jeeps shattered this calculus. A Wehrmacht after-action report from February 1945, captured from the 12th Volksgrenadier Division, describes an engagement near the village of Bullingen. German infantry, dug into positions overlooking a supply route, engaged a convoy of American jeeps with machine gun fire at a range of approximately 300 meters. Standard doctrine. Standard tactics. They had executed this same ambush dozens of times. The first burst, aimed at the lead vehicle's engine block, should have disabled the jeep and blocked the road, allowing the Germans to systematically destroy the remaining vehicles. Instead, the rounds sparked off the vehicle's hood and the jeep accelerated, closing the distance while returning fire. The German gunner, confused, adjusted his aim and fired again. More sparks. The jeep kept coming. A third burst, aimed at the driver. Rounds that should have killed him struck something in front of the windshield and deflected. The jeep, impossibly, survived long enough to reach cover and return effective fire, forcing the German position to withdraw. The report's author, a lieutenant whose name has been lost to history, noted with barely concealed frustration that the Americans had apparently begun armoring their light vehicles. He recommended updated tactical guidance. His tone suggested not just surprise, but something deeper, a kind of weary resignation. The Americans, who already had more of everything, were now improving what they had. The one small advantage, the jeep's vulnerability, had been eliminated. This pattern repeated across the Western Front. German units that had learned to target jeeps as priority targets, that had counted on their ability to eliminate American command and control vehicles with relative ease, found themselves firing at vehicles that simply refused to die according to the established rules. Machine gun fire that should have been lethal sparked off crude armor plates. Ambushes that should have been devastating produced survivable casualties. The psychological impact was cumulative and corrosive. It was not the armor itself that mattered, not really. It was what the armor represented. The Americans were not content with their existing massive advantages. They were innovating, adapting, improving their equipment in the field using captured German materials. The message was unmistakable. We have so much abundance that we can afford to waste your best armor by bolting it onto our lightest vehicles. We are so creative, so flexible, so unconstrained by doctrine that our mechanics in the field can solve in one night problems that your engineers cannot solve in factories. There exists, in the holdings of the U.S. National Archives, a collection of letters written by German soldiers and intercepted by Allied intelligence. One letter, dated March 1945, was written by an Obergefreiter, a senior private named Klaus Dietrich, to his wife in Bavaria. Dietrich describes with the tired prose of a man who has seen too much, an encounter with an American jeep that had been armored with plates taken from our own dead tanks. He describes firing his rifle at the vehicle, watching the rounds deflect and experiencing what he calls a kind of grief. It is not that we are losing, he writes. We have known we would lose for months now. It is that they take even our defeats and make them into their strength. They scavenge our armor like crows picking at a carcass and use it to protect themselves from us. There is something terrible in this, something final. The letter was intercepted, translated, filed, and forgotten. But it captures something that the technical reports miss, the moral dimension of innovation under pressure. Stoppelman's modification was not just a tactical adaptation. It was a statement about the different characters of the armies that faced each other in the war's final months. The German military in 1945 was rigid, hierarchical, dependent on approved doctrine and centralized control. Innovation came from the top down, from engineers and officers and official channels. The idea that a corporal might modify his vehicle using enemy materials without approval was, within the Wehrmacht's organizational culture, nearly unthinkable. not because it was forbidden, though it was, but because the culture did not produce soldiers who thought that way. The machine was designed to operate according to specifications. Deviation was disorder. The American military, for all its own bureaucratic rigidity, had imported something from its civilian culture, the assumption that problems could be solved by the person closest to the problem, using whatever materials were at hand. Stoppelman was a product of American industrial culture, of an economy that celebrated the garage tinkerer and the assembly line improviser. He saw a problem, identified available resources, and implemented a solution without waiting for permission. The fact that his solution violated technical specifications was irrelevant. The fact that it worked was everything. This difference, this fundamental difference in how the two militaries approached problems, was as decisive as any advantage in tanks or planes. An army that can adapt is an army that can survive mistakes, can overcome shortages, can turn defeats into lessons. An army that cannot adapt can only execute its existing doctrine with increasing desperation until that doctrine fails. By April 1945, the Wehrmacht was executing doctrine that had failed months earlier, following orders that no longer corresponded to reality, fighting with tactics designed for an army that no longer existed. The Americans were welding German armor onto their jeeps. The symbolic weight of this act, using enemy armor to protect American vehicles, deserves particular attention, for it connects to a larger pattern visible throughout the American conduct of the war. In the Pacific Theater, American forces captured Japanese weapons and used them against their former owners. Not because American weapons were inferior, but because ammunition for Japanese rifles was abundant in captured supply dumps, and every round fired from a captured weapon was a round that didn't need to be shipped across the Pacific. In North Africa, American tank crews learned to appreciate captured German optics and rangefinders, stripping them from destroyed Panzers and installing them in Shermans. In Italy, entire American artillery batteries fired German ammunition through captured German guns because the supply situation made this more practical than waiting for American ordnance to arrive through congested ports. This was not standard practice in other armies. German forces certainly captured and used Allied equipment when necessary, but it was viewed as a temporary expedient, a sign of supply failure rather than a demonstration of flexibility. The Soviet Army, despite facing catastrophic equipment shortages in the war's early years, rarely incorporated captured German weapons into standard use, preferring to maintain doctrinal purity even at significant cost. The American practice of enthusiastically adopting enemy equipment was something different. It spoke to a kind of pragmatism that bordered on philosophical. The question was not what are we supposed to use, but what works. The answer to that question might be American, might be German, might be cobbled together from three different sources. The origin was irrelevant. Function was everything. In Stoppelman's modification, this pragmatism achieved a kind of perfection. The Jeep, that icon of American industrial capitalism, was improved using armor from a German tank, that icon of fascist military power. The result was superior to either component alone. American mobility protected by German armor, creating a hybrid that neither side could have produced working within their own doctrinal limitations. There was poetry in this, though none of the men doing the work would have described it that way. They would have called it making do or field expedient solutions, or in the blunt language of soldiers, unfucking the situation. But poetry it was, the literal beating of swords into plowshares, or in this case beating tanks into survival. And the Germans noticed. Of course they noticed. In prisoner of war interrogations conducted in March and April 1945, multiple German soldiers made reference to American vehicles with stolen armor or captured plates. The tone in these references varies, sometimes bitter, sometimes resigned, sometimes tinged with reluctant admiration. But the underlying message is consistent. The Americans were not playing by the expected rules. They were making new rules. They were winning not just because they had more resources, but because they used those resources with a flexibility that German military culture could not match. One Wehrmacht Oberst, a colonel, captured in April near the Ruhr pocket, told his interrogators that fighting the Americans was like fighting a fire that learns from water. Each attempt to counter American tactics seemed only to teach them how to counter the counter. Each German innovation was studied, adapted, and incorporated. The Americans, he said, had no shame about learning from their enemies. They stole ideas the way they stole armor plates, cheerfully, pragmatically, without regard for pride or doctrine. He meant it as an insult. The interrogation report notes that the translator, an American lieutenant, took it as a compliment. The specific fate of Eugene Stoppelman's first modified Jeep has been lost to history, as have most individual vehicles from the war. But the general pattern is known. Modified Jeeps saw action throughout the final months of the European campaign. They participated in the crossing of the Rhine, the encirclement of the Ruhr, the drive through central Germany. Some were destroyed despite their armor. 50 millimeters of steel will not stop an anti-tank round or artillery shell. Some broke down from the additional stress on their suspensions and transmissions. Some simply wore out, as all vehicles do. But enough survived to demonstrate the concept's value. A post-war survey of company commanders in the Third Army found that units with modified Jeeps reported vehicle survival rates approximately 10 times higher than unmodified vehicles during engagements involving small arms fire. 10 times. Stoppelman's crude modification, implemented with salvaged materials and improvised tools, had achieved a tenfold increase in survivability. The human cost of this improvement is harder to quantify, but no less real. Every Jeep that survived a burst of machine gun fire represented a driver who lived, a commander who could continue directing his unit, a supply run that reached its destination. The mathematics of survival are brutal but simple. In combat, living is better than dying, and anything that increases the probability of living is valuable beyond measure. Stoppelman himself survived the war. He returned to Detroit in October 1945, went back to work at the Ford plant, and lived an apparently unremarkable life. The Army awarded him no medals for his modification. There was no established procedure for recognizing unauthorized vehicle improvements. His name appears in no official histories. The after-action reports and technical studies that documented the spread of improvised armor modifications do not mention him specifically, referring only to field mechanics and unit-level innovation. He died in 1987, at the age of 65, of heart disease. His obituary in the Detroit Free Press makes no mention of the war, noting only that he was a longtime Ford employee and devoted family man. The knowledge of what he had done, of how many lives his modification had saved, seems to have died with him. His children, interviewed years later by a military historian researching vehicle modifications in the European theater, expressed surprise that their father's wartime service had been notable in any way. He had never spoken of it. This silence is itself revealing. Stoppelman had done nothing that fit the traditional narrative of military valor. He had not stormed a machine gun nest, had not held a position against overwhelming odds, had not sacrificed himself for his comrades. He had simply seen a problem, identified a solution, and implemented it using available materials. In his own estimation, this was apparently not worthy of mention. But the men who drove the modified Jeeps, the men who survived ambushes that would have killed them in unmodified vehicles, would have disagreed. The statistical evidence certainly disagrees. Stoppelman's contribution to the Allied victory was modest in scope, but profound in impact. He had altered the survival calculus for thousands of soldiers. He had demonstrated the power of decentralized innovation. He had, in his small way, changed how the United States Army thought about the relationship between doctrine and adaptation. And he had done it with a piece of German armor, a broken fuel line, and 6 hours of work in the frozen darkness of a Belgian forest. The broader implications of Stoppelman's modification extend beyond the immediate tactical and engineering lessons. They touch on fundamental questions about the nature of industrial warfare, the relationship between standardization and adaptation, and the sources of military effectiveness. The Second World War was the first fully industrialized conflict, the first war in which victory was determined as much by factory output as by battlefield tactics. The traditional metrics of military power, courage, discipline, tactical skill, remained important, but they were subordinate to the brutal arithmetic of production. Whichever side could build more tanks, more planes, more guns would eventually overwhelm the other, through sheer material advantage. The United States embraced this logic completely. American war production was staggering in scale. 300,000 aircraft, 80,000 tanks, 5,000 cargo ships, 640,000 jeeps. This abundance was intentional, designed, strategic. American military doctrine in World War II was built on the assumption of material superiority. The plan was not to build better weapons than the Germans, though American engineers certainly tried, but to build adequate weapons in such quantities that superiority became irrelevant. But this strategy contained a potential weakness. Standardization, the key to mass production, could also create rigidity. If the standard design was flawed, you might produce thousands of flawed vehicles before the problem was identified and corrected. If battlefield conditions changed, standardized equipment might prove inadequate, and the time required to design, test, and manufacture improved versions could be measured in years. Stoppelman's modification represented a solution to this weakness: localized adaptation using standardized platforms. The Jeep itself remained standardized, produced by the hundreds of thousands according to identical specifications. But at the unit level, soldiers modified those standardized platforms to meet specific tactical needs using available materials. The result was a hybrid system that combined the efficiency of mass production with the flexibility of customization. This was not supposed to be possible. Industrial production theory, as understood in 1945, suggested that standardization and customization were mutually exclusive. You could have one or the other, but not both. The genius of the American approach, not planned by any general or engineer, but emergent from the culture of the soldiers themselves, was to maintain standardization at the production level while encouraging customization at the deployment level. The German military, by contrast, had struggled throughout the war with the opposite problem. German weapons were often superior in quality to their Allied equivalents. The Panther tank was better than the Sherman. The MG-42 machine gun was better than the Browning. The 88mm anti-aircraft gun, when used in the anti-tank role, was devastatingly effective. But German production could not match Allied production. For every Panther, the Americans built 5 Shermans. For every 88mm gun, the Americans built 10 76mm guns. German efforts to improve their weapons often made this problem worse. The constant refinements, the endless pursuit of technical superiority, the addition of new features and capabilities, all of this made German weapons more complex, more difficult to manufacture, more expensive to produce. The Tiger II tank was a masterpiece of engineering, nearly invulnerable from the front, mounting a gun that could destroy any Allied tank at ranges exceeding 2 kilometers. It was also monumentally expensive, required specialized manufacturing facilities, and was produced in quantities so small that its impact on the war was negligible. The American approach was simpler and, ultimately, more effective. Produce adequate equipment in overwhelming quantities, then allow soldiers to modify that equipment in the field to address specific shortcomings. This distributed the innovation process, allowing thousands of mechanics and soldiers to experiment with improvements. Rather than relying on centralized engineering departments to solve every problem, Stoppelman's armor modification was merely the most visible example of this process. Throughout the war, American soldiers modified their equipment in countless ways. They mounted additional machine guns on tanks. They welded spare track links onto hull fronts for extra protection. They fabricated field telephones from captured German equipment. They modified rifle slings, canteen carriers, helmet straps, boot linings. Each modification was small, but in aggregate they represented a massive distributed effort to improve the tools of war. The German military hierarchy actively discouraged this kind of bottom-up innovation. Modifications were supposed to be approved by higher authority, implemented according to technical specifications, documented in official records. A German corporal who modified his vehicle using enemy materials would likely face disciplinary action. The Wehrmacht valued uniformity, doctrine, standardization. The chaos of improvised modifications ran counter to these values. But uniformity cannot adapt. Doctrine cannot learn. Standardization cannot respond to local conditions. The very qualities that made the Wehrmacht effective in the early war years, discipline, standardization, hierarchical control, became liabilities as the war ground on and circumstances changed. An organization that cannot adapt will eventually fail when the environment exceeds its design parameters. The American military could adapt because its culture permitted, even encouraged, the kind of improvisation that Stoppelman represented. This was not a military virtue, not something taught in officer training or codified in regulations. It was a civilian virtue imported from American industrial and social culture. Americans were accustomed to tinkering, to improving, to modifying. The hot rod culture, the farm equipment modifications, the endless American drive to customize and personalize, all of this transferred to military equipment in wartime. The modified Jeeps were hot rods with armor. The soldiers who built them were mechanics who happened to be wearing uniforms. The entire phenomenon was deeply, quintessentially American in character, pragmatic, individualistic, unconcerned with official approval, focused on results rather than process. And it worked. God help the Germans, but it worked. In the final analysis, the story of Stoppelman's modification is not really about Jeeps or armor or welding techniques. It is about the philosophy of problem-solving under existential pressure, about the differences between brittle and resilient systems, about what happens when doctrine meets desperation, and desperation wins. The German military in World War II was a brittle system. It was highly optimized for a specific type of warfare, rapid, mechanized, aggressive, and when conditions matched those parameters, it was devastatingly effective. But it could not adapt when conditions changed. When the quick victories became wars of attrition, when the material balance shifted against Germany, when the tactical situations no longer matched doctrinal assumptions, the Wehrmacht had no mechanism for fundamental adaptation. It could only execute its existing doctrine with increasing desperation until that doctrine shattered under the weight of reality. The American military was a resilient system. It was not optimized for any specific type of warfare. It was awkward, sometimes inefficient, prone to mistakes. But it could learn. It could adapt. It could absorb lessons from defeat and incorporate them into future operations. Most importantly, it distributed the responsibility for adaptation throughout its structure, allowing corporals like Stoppelman to solve problems without waiting for generals to issue directives. This resilience was not a military innovation. It was a fundamental characteristic of American society, visible in every domain from business to science to popular culture. Americans were comfortable with failure because they expected to learn from it. Americans were comfortable with improvisation because they did not trust authority to have all the answers. Americans were comfortable with modification because they believed that nothing was ever finished, that everything could be improved, that the version that came from the factory was merely the starting point rather than the final form. These cultural traits served America well in war, though they came from peace. The same pragmatism that built business empires from garage startups built modified Jeeps from salvaged armor. The same disrespect for established authority that characterized American democracy characterized American tactical innovation. The same restless drive for improvement that made American capitalism dynamic made American military equipment adaptable. The Germans, for all their technical skill and tactical proficiency, could not match this. Their culture did not produce soldiers who questioned doctrine or modified equipment without permission. Their system did not reward improvisation or tolerate deviation from standards. When Stoppelman welded German armor onto an American Jeep, he was not just solving a tactical problem. He was demonstrating the victory of one cultural philosophy over another. This is why the modified Jeeps matter, why they deserve more than a footnote in the vast literature of World War II. They represent in miniature the character of the American war effort, abundant, adaptable, pragmatic, unconcerned with elegance or doctrine, focused absolutely on the singular goal of surviving today so that tomorrow might be won. There is one final piece of evidence that deserves mention, one last document that connects Stoppelman's modification to the larger story of the war. In June 1945, after Germany's surrender but before Japan's, a technical intelligence team from the U.S. Army's Ordnance Department examined a collection of captured German vehicles at a depot in Mannheim. Among these vehicles was a Kugelwagen, the Maulbohr, German equivalent of the Jeep, that had been modified by its crew using armor plates salvaged from an American M4 Sherman tank. The report describing this vehicle notes the modification with clinical detachment. measuring the thickness of the armor, documenting the welding techniques, assessing the impact on vehicle performance. But at the end of the report, the examining officer includes an observation that reads, in the dry language of military documentation, as something close to poetry. The vehicle represents a clear attempt to replicate modifications observed on captured American vehicles. The use of enemy armor for protection suggests tactical imitation. Quality of workmanship is poor compared to American examples examined previously. Vehicle was found abandoned, apparently due to mechanical failure of transmission, likely stress related to additional weight. This examiner's assessment: too little, too late. Too little, too late. The Germans had seen what the Americans were doing, had understood the value of the modification, had attempted to replicate it. But they were working with inferior materials, without the industrial base to support widespread implementation, without the cultural flexibility to make improvisation standard practice. They had learned the lesson, but learning the lesson in June 1945 was worthless. The lesson needed to be learned in January. But they could not learn it in January because their system did not produce Eugene Stoppelmans. Their culture did not encourage corporals to modify vehicles using enemy materials without approval. Their doctrine did not permit that kind of decentralized innovation. By the time they understood what the Americans were doing, by the time they tried to copy it, the war was already lost. This ultimately is the significance of the modified Jeep. Not the armor itself, not the improved survival rates, not even the tactical advantage. The significance is that the American system could produce this innovation in January and distribute it throughout an army by March, while the German system could only recognize its value in June when recognition no longer mattered. The modified Jeep was not a weapon. It was a demonstration of adaptive capacity. It was proof that the side which could learn faster, adapt quicker, and incorporate lessons more effectively would eventually prevail regardless of the tactical situation at any given moment. And so, in the end, the story of how one GI's Junkyard fix made Jeeps survive German fire 10 times longer is not really a story about Jeeps at all. It is a story about democracy versus fascism, about resilient systems versus brittle systems, about the difference between armies that can learn and armies that can only execute doctrine until doctrine fails. It is a story about 50 millimeters of salvaged armor plate, welded onto a quarter-ton truck by a corporal from Detroit, changing the mathematics of survival on the Western Front. It is a story about American abundance meeting American ingenuity, meeting American pragmatism, and producing something that the Wehrmacht, for all its tactical skill and technical proficiency, could not match. It is a story about a moment in the frozen darkness of a Belgian forest, when one soldier decided that the specifications were wrong and the doctrine was negotiable, and that survival mattered more than regulations. It is a story about how wars are won not just by those who fight the hardest, but by those who adapt the fastest. And it is, in the end, a story about a Jeep that refused to die, because the man who drove it had refused to accept death as inevitable. The snow continued to fall over the Ardennes that winter, burying the wrecked vehicles and the frozen corpses and the spent shell casings. But somewhere in that snow, armor-plated Jeeps rolled forward, their crews protected by the ingenuity of a man who had understood that the rules could be rewritten if the need was great enough. They rolled forward and forward and forward again, toward a spring that would bring victory and a summer that would bring peace. And they survived.